And I have to thank everyone as well for being inside right now. There's still snow on the ground in Edmonton, so I'm really excited to be a part of this larger series on the nature of Canada. And what I decided to do with my sort of given area, which is climate in this instance, was to present an exploration of climate changes in the Prairie West between 1880 and 1940 as a means by which to consider the history of climate change in Canada. The research that I've done has actually largely been focused on a different regional environment, that being northern Canada. In the past, I also worked a little bit on climate change in eastern Canada. So in a sense, you can ask, why am I talking about the West today? But I'll come to that in a moment. What I did want to touch upon just briefly is the fact that that I'm not talking about the North isn't because there isn't an important history of climate change there. There exists impressive paleoclimatological and archaeological work that demonstrates the long-standing relationship between cultural and climatic changes in Arctic and subarctic environments. Such research from the North has been effectively synthesized by Renee Fawcett in her work In Order to Live Untroubled, and now stands alongside an explosion of more recent research into the understanding of and the physical and social implications of climate changes that are in part presently underway. Important contributions to this latter literature include, of course, Julie Cruikshank's Do Glaciers Listen?, Zacharias Kunuk and Ian Morrow's film Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, which if you haven't watched it, I would encourage you to do so. You can just go to Isuma TV and watch it. And even Emily Cameron's recent article critiquing constructs of vulnerability and adaptation in the Canadian Arctic. However, much of this work, or much of the northern work, is situated more effectively within a circumpolar rather than a Canadian context. It looks to the present and the future more than the past, and it resonates with themes most relevant to science and technology studies. For Western Canada, however, while there's still a lot of research that needs to be undertaken and long-standing debates underway, and interestingly enough, these debates are actually more active in the geography and science communities than they are in the history community, even though they are profoundly historical in nature. The particular experience of this region with climate change around the turn of the century and its direct relationship to newcomer adaptations to prairie environments encourage using this particular context to explore certain key questions in the history of climate change in Canada. So these questions are first, how do we define change with regards to climate? And that's actually not as simple as it seems. Whereas recently as last year, I may have turned this talk at this particular moment to define climate as the average of conditions, being temperature, precipitation, wind, etc., for a particular place in a particular period of time, and to distinguish this from weather, which are the day-to-day or more intermittent experience of same conditions. Much recent historical research, including my own, has made it apparent that the instability of the definition of climate itself. Climate is, unsurprisingly, a historical construct, and how it is constructed resonates with scientific and political significance. And this, therefore, is part of what I wish to explore with you today. Where I've included culture in my title, it is how cultures make climates through knowledge and practice. The second part of my talk will engage with the central theme of this series and the second question that I've presented here, namely, how does climate change relate to Canadian history, and when and where has it played a transformative role? And it is in my desire to answer these questions that I look to my current home, Western Canada, because it is here where I think you can most clearly see how climate change in the West has transformed the history of Canada, and in turn, how the history of Western Canada will transform climate. I don't have the opportunity to get into the latter half of this issue today, although I may get into it in the chapter or elsewhere. It, of course, relates to the role of coal, oil, and gas industries, as well as industrial agriculture in driving anthropogenic climate change, and the political influence of Western Canada and Western Canadians in promoting climate skepticism and opposing efforts at mitigation. That's a discussion for another time. But for today, I want to turn first to global droughts, prairie fires, and Western settlement. So the history of climate and resettlement in the 19th century plains is most often told as a local or regional history. The Prairie West is generally conceptualized in historical and scientific literature from a bioregional perspective. It's unsurprising that it was a historian of the American West, Dan Flores, who came up over lunch today, who most effectively explained bioregions to environmental historians. So this is a perspective on the grasslands or the Great Plains, or in Canada's case, the Northern Great Plains, that looks outward. Consideration of the history of fire, for instance, has focused upon the respective roles of lightning strikes and human fire setting in the prairies, as well as the importance of fire to grasslands ecosystems. Certainly, this question has received attention because of the importance of Aboriginal fire to understanding Indigenous management and manipulation of grasslands environments, as well as the transformative change attendant upon the arrival of European, Canadian, American, and other newcomers, and specifically the measures that they all took in relatively short order in order to suppress or control fire. This, in turn, has been the subject of greatest attention when it comes to the history of fires in Canada. Thank you. In general, and the West in particular, as we see in the fire control policies of the national parks, or the creation of the Dominion Forest Branch as an integral part of conservation policy in Canada. But the history of fire on the plains is not just a tale of control, whether Indigenous or newcomer, but also a history of climate and of the relationship between the Great Plains and global climate dynamics, or, to use the language of atmospheric scientists, the teleconnections that extend beyond North America. So in the 1890s, settlement was still relatively sparse in Western Canada, and this is just one visualization provided by the Historical Atlas of Canada. As we all probably know quite well, things changed rapidly in the first part of the 20th century. This is, of course, showing the degree of change in the first part of the 20th century, with the darker areas showing the areas of greatest change. And clearly, the Prairie West is one of the regions of most rapid population growth. If we start to look at the 1890s, there's a striking history of fires from that decade. In just one publication, Pioneer Days in Bardo, Alberta, including sketches of early surrounding settlements by Ragnar Steen and Magda Hendrickson, they present a whole chapter on prairie fires, just some of which I've excerpted here. And I don't expect you to read all this right now, but I will highlight the sort of key aspects of it. So they write, during the spring and early summer of 1895, there had been a heavy growth of vegetation since there was no rain in the latter part of the season. Creeks and sloughs were dry, making conditions ideal for great forest and prairie fires. They then proceed with an extended description of an experience of a prairie fire. They turn to talk about the summer and fall of 1896 were also very dry. It was impossible to put out the fires before the snow came, as the sod was so dry that it would smolder and burn indefinitely. Heavier rainfall during the following years lessened the danger of fire, and the community experienced some smaller fires, but never any one like the one in the fall of 1895. So obviously, a decline in fires after 1895 contributes to narratives of pioneer forbearance against an adverse environment. But there's other evidence of a decline in fires as well, physical evidence, other documentary evidence, photographic evidence, and so forth. So it's not just pioneer narratives where we see this story told. So that's not how we can explain it. Given that after the 1890s, fires lessened in severity and extent, this shift has been attributed to a number of factors. The geographer Bill Rainey argued that it was the demise of the bison in the 1870s and the spread of agriculture from the 1880s onwards, which led to fires becoming less frequent and smaller in extent. But this actually doesn't explain the intensity of fire in the 1890s. The railroad and its construction are seen to have brought a new source of ignition of industrial fire to the plains. But a new source of ignition was one that didn't simultaneously create new fuel, nor the conditions to fan the flames. Indeed, the forest historian Peter Murphy has suggested that the role of the railway or of surveyors making lines of sight and using fire for that purpose has actually been overstated in the fire transition in this period. And what all of these things do, the spread of settlement after the 1890s, the end of the bison hunt, and the role of the railroad, they all mask the much more important role played by drought. Whether fire was initiated by a lightning strike or a human hands is in some respects secondary to the underlying conditions that enabled the fire to take hold and spread. And just as fires consumed trees and provided the impetus to record something of the environmental conditions that help us to understand prairie climate at this time, so too the trees themselves present a record of drought. In one article, earth scientists Cook, Seeger, Kane, and Stala have used continental tree ring evidence to reconstruct droughts. And their research is greatly appreciated because it is actually continental in scope. So they don't truncate at the 49th parallel like so much other research does. And they, and they're not just extending the lines north. They've taken tree ring data from both Mexico and from Canada to make this continental in scale. That said, what they've highlighted in their work is still American and carries with it some differences from what we'd see in Canada. So one of the things that they discuss is the periods in time when you see, for instance, the West being described as a Great American Desert versus a garden, and that these match up in the American case at least very closely with periods of wetness for the garden myth or periods of drought for the Great American Desert myth. They don't work quite so well once you cross the border. Closer to home, however, David Sotchin and Walter Skinner, using PDSI data, so the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which was it's an index that was developed in the 1960s and uses temperature and rainfall information in a formula to determine dryness. They've used this data along with tree ring index chronologies to create a record that extends from the 16th century to the present. Here, this is just illustrating from the 18th century to to about the present from Medicine Hat. But one of the things that you see here and that they've demonstrated in the much longer index as well is that there's clusters of drought years from the 17th century. There's clusters in the 1690s, 1720s, 1750s, the 1790s, the 1820s, the 1850s, and the 1890s, demonstrating a 20 to 25-year cycle of drought. So what are the causes of these droughts? According to Cook and his co-authors, there was a wet period in the 1870s that corresponded to El Niños, and this was followed by recurrent drought in the late 1880s and 1890s that corresponded to a persistent La Niña-like state. La Niña is the counterpart of El Niño, the anti-El Niño. It's when you have lower than normal sea surface temperatures rather than higher than normal sea surface temperatures, and likewise lower air surface pressure in the Western Pacific. And so it's the counterpart, it's the other coupled ocean atmospheric phenomenon that makes up the ENSO, the El Niño-La Niña Southern Oscillation. Since the 1990s, researchers have identified tropical sea surface temperatures, and in particular tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures, as the ultimate driver of sustained multi-year droughts over North America. Cook and his co-authors themselves identify the developments that allowed this breakthrough. In the late 1990s, there was the first persistent drought, which some of you might recall from the Prairie West, since the 1950s. This raised interest and provided evidence of what was going on in the tropical Pacific that could be captured with new instruments. And so some of the work that was done in that instance was a part of a project called the Tropical Ocean Global Atmosphere, or TOGA, Coupled Ocean Atmosphere Response Experiment, CORE. There won't be a test afterwards on that. This was a field experiment in 1992-93 that studied atmospheric and oceanic pressures over the region of the Western Pacific, where sort of warm ocean and atmospheric conditions had been linked to the El Niño climate variation. So some of you might remember that it was sort of after the 90s that all of a sudden we were all talking about El Niño, and this is where the evidence came from, these sort of sustained field studies. So they had a whole, there was a new interest and new sort of ways of looking at the role of El Niño in global environments in the 90s. There was also a research advance that enabled the creation of sea surface temperature and sea ice data sets extending back to 1856 using sparse ship-based observations. In this instance, it was a United Kingdom Meteorological Office historical sea surface temperature data set, and in a description of this research, the researchers involved in taking this sort of sparse data and turning it into something usable said that they wanted to extract as much information as possible from the scanty instrumental record available to us. So even though all that instrumental record or instrumental information from the 19th century was partial and incomplete, it was something. And now there was an interest in using that something to try to understand the history of climate. And so this is precisely what happens. There's a change in the attitude of climate modelers who up until that point had really been only engaged in model simulations that began in the 1950s and ended before the 1990s, because this is when they had information from the upper air which they could use to verify what they were looking at. Now they had this longer time series. The modelers became more interested in conducting simulations that began earlier and captured the Dust Bowl, and ultimately led to these conclusions about El Nino and La Nina, to the point that researchers sort of asserted that it was the observed, quote, global sea surface temperature anomaly of the 1890s, which has a classic persistent La Nina-like pattern with a broad area of colder than usual waters in the eastern tropical Pacific, warmer waters in the central and western subtropical and mid-latitude Pacific Ocean, cool waters along the Pacific coasts of the Americas, and a cool Indian Ocean. Global sea surface temperature anomalies are not the only global forcing mechanisms that we know of. Solar irradiance, most commonly in the form of 11-year sunspot cycles, and volcanic activity are both known to have varying and significant global climatic effects. But this particular example takes us from historical evidence of parched fields and fierce fires in the 1890s to an understanding of the global teleconnections that in some respects bound the famines that Mike Davis has written about in Southeast Asia, which were a direct consequence of the El Nino conditions in that part of the world, to the climate for settlement in southern Alberta, irrespective of shared colonial systems of governance. In seeking to understand these dynamics, obviously we have to move beyond local, regional, or even hemispheric analyses to recognize first, the complexity of the climate system. Second, the significant role of global interconnections or teleconnections. And finally, the importance of modeling to present-day climate science, which also informs historical research. For our purposes, however, 1896 was not just the tail end of a persistent La Nina pattern over the West, but actually a more critical conjuncture in Canadian history. It was, of course, the end of the drought in the Great Plains and the accompanying fires. But it was also, of course, the year that the Laurier Liberals were elected and Clifford Sifton was appointed Minister of the Interior, and his enthusiastic support for European immigration to the Prairie West, he was, of course, the man with the quote about the sheepskin coats, combined with the closure of the American frontier that Frederick Jackson Turner had asserted in 1893, had dramatic consequences for Western landscapes as immigration to the Prairie West boomed. So what I want to deal with in the second part of my talk is to address the question, what was the climate of the prairies? And here, what I want to start off by is asking whether the climate variations in the period from 1890 to 1920 constitute climate change. In a sense, what was happening in this period was normal, to the extent that it was linked to ENSO. If ENSO forcing is normal or regular, and there are clear patterns at work with some regularity about every 5 years, and they're global in character, then does this still constitute change? El Nino is even characterized by Environment Canada in this fashion. El Nino is, quote, the second largest driver of the world's weather, second only to normal seasonal warming and cooling, which also brings changes in precipitation patterns. By such a definition, ENSO is no more climate change than is the seasonal transition from warm to cold. It simply operates on a different schedule with different interrelationships, but it's nothing greater than that. However, in this instance and in others, the experience of an El Nino-La Nina episode was one of a changing climate. And this reinforces the need to ask about the historical understanding and experience of climate change. In the West, in the 19th century, the emphasis from scientists and government, who relied on a lot of the science that was underway, was on discerning the suitability of climate for settlement and exploitation. In keeping with learned discourse from across the Western world, scientists and agents of the Canadian state saw climate as vulnerable to human activity. They saw colonization as a means to subdue wild environments. But in some respects, more influential to Canadian history was simply what various explorers saw in the West. And here again, I'm revisiting a well-known theme in Canadian history. And this is the history of the Western expeditions that straddled Confederation and mostly preceded the treaty settlements. These are, of course, the Palliser expedition from 1857 to 1860, Henry Yule Hind's 2 expeditions into the Red River, Assiniboine, and Saskatchewan countries in 1857 and 1858, and John McCoon's 5 separate surveys of regional potential and railway routes between 1872 and 1881. as Doug Oram taught us in his Promise of Eden. These expeditions were highly influential because of the role of the expansionist movement in central Canada, which sought to convince Canadians that the West should be first acquired and then settled in order to complete the progress from colony to nation to empire. They enabled a reassessment of soil and climate, and the image of the West was transformed from a semi-Arctic wilderness to a fertile garden well adapted to agricultural pursuits. The British North American Exploring Expedition, which was the Palliser Expedition, extended from the Red River to the Rocky Mountains and was funded by the British Royal Geographical Society. Its conclusions were foremost that there was some semi-arid country, Palliser's Triangle, which stretched across the American border into the prairies. And here I have done what our neighbors to the south of us do. I have truncated the triangle at the 49th parallel. And that the driest part, which is the darkest orange, was surrounded by a more fertile belt well suited for stock raising and agriculture. Henry Yule Hines expeditions into the Red River, Assiniboine and Saskatchewan countries, now under the auspices of the Canadian government, came to essentially similar conclusions as Palliser, declaring the land within Palliser's Triangle as unfit for agriculture and essentially a desert. This image received considerable revision in the next decade as Dominion surveyors narrowed the range of the triangle and John McCune revisited notions of its potential. McCune traveled through the Cypress Hills, Fort Walsh, and the large sandhills near the South Saskatchewan River, reported on crops growing at Fort Walsh, which led him to conclude that while the area might not be entirely ideal, it certainly was not a desert. He sent reports back east to this effect, and so by 1880, when he returned to Winnipeg, Palliser's Triangle was dispelled as a region unsuited to agriculture, and now all of the prairies were ideal. Of course, this was a colonial project, and so to a certain extent, McCune was seeing that which the Canadian government, or Sanford Fleming, who was the person who specifically recruited him, wanted him to see. But it was also the case that the climate had changed. We've seen that the end of the persistent La Nina-like state and its associated drought came in 1896, just as Sifton was promoting immigration and as regulations changed to promote homesteading over ranching. And here we see Sifton saying explicitly that there is no desert country in the Prairie West. And he was right for 1896. At this point in time, we have what's called the early 20th century pluvial, which is centered on 1915, being the wettest year, and significantly a year of bumper crops in the driest part of the Palliser's Triangle. The other important thing that we see here is that the pluvial was actually concentrated in Western Canada, or in the western part of North America. It didn't extend equally over all of North America. So there's an east-west moisture index at play, both in terms of drought and in terms of wet periods. So it's not just that McCune was seeing what other people wanted him to see, it was that he was actually seeing something different in the 1870s, and again that the settlers themselves were seeing something different when they started to move in. After 1896, the government commitment to settlement intensified. Dryland agricultural techniques would deal with inadequate water. The Liberals began to auction off their system of stock watering reserves. And we see the final demise of the ranching industry in the first decade of the 20th century. Here we have the last big cattle roundup in 1907. So we have reports of climate, experience of climate, and agricultural opportunities related to climate all changing at the turn of the century. There's also another change underway. Richard Grove's work on tropical island colonies demonstrated that the environmental consequences of deforestation, and in particular desertification, were apparent as early as the 18th century. Others, George Perkins Marsh, in his 1864 Man and Nature, offered a long historical perspective of human influence on climate, again through deforestation in particular. Historians of science, Fabien Locher and Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, emphasize how in the 18th and early 19th century, learned discourse embraced a much more expansive understanding of climate than it would later. Europeans and Americans recognized climate as changeable on short and long timescales to minor and major drivers. They also made it vulnerable to human activity and thus interactive with human history. As Fleming wrote in an introduction to a special issue on climate published in Osiris, quote, "Climate has more often been defined as what it does rather than what it is. This means that climate has not usually been seen as an indicator of weather trends, but as a force and a resource informing social habits, economic welfare, health, diet, and even the total energy of nations. Climate was seen as influencing human life directly in its impacts upon health and in shaping races, and in turn, human activity was seen to have direct impacts upon climate." Locher and Fressoz argue that it is in the mid-19th century that we see a shift away from this understanding of climate as a malleable and changeable thing. We see a shift away from climate-based ideologies in health with the rise instead of germ theory. Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolution placed greater emphasis on inheritance over environment, even within the rapidly evolving racial thought of the period. And in the earth sciences, attention became focused upon the ice ages. Indeed, as geological time deepened through the work of Charles Lyell and William Smith in asserting that rock strata represented successive time periods, and with Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism, the possibility for a significant human influence upon major changes in Earth's history receded. Thus, and here I'm quoting, "The idea of man-made climatic change lost currency, while there was a shift in the very notion of climate that came to have a more restrictive meaning and depict a certain regularity in mean atmospheric variables, temperature, hygrometry, and so on. Climate was no longer presented as an adaptable matrix of both human and natural changes, but as a set framework that lays down the conditions for practicing agriculture or for maritime transport or housing." So the trajectory that these historians describe went from an understanding of human influence upon climate to the idea that climate changes were at the very long-term scale, that they were not caused by people, and this is when climate takes on this more restrictive meaning as an index. This transition wasn't perfect. Where Locher and Fressoz identify the mid-19th century as a turning point, this has to be seen as a beginning, not an end of a transition, because we continue to see earlier ideas of climate persisting. The Forestry Commissioner J.H. Morgan, in his annual report to the Department of the Interior for 1884, wrote, quote, the inevitable consequences of future neglect of fire control will be, among other climatic changes, drought varied by sudden and destructive flood, and a deterioration of the quality of the soil." There were as well the continuing ideas that linked climate and health in the West. Wilderness therapy, while most pronounced in the early 19th century as a treatment for tuberculosis, still held considerable sway in the late 19th and even into the 20th centuries. And there was, of course, as well this idea that rain follows the plow. Kingman Knott Robbins, who was the treasurer of the Associated Mortgage Investors of Rochester, New York, and this company was a dominant investor in Alberta lands, wrote, "It's a matter of common observation that the rainfall in a newly settled prairie country increases with settlement, cultivation, and tree planting." He cited Louis Agassiz, who theorized that the building of railroads and settlements invariably disturbed the electrical currents in the winds and brought rain. "As the area of cultivable lands is increased," he wrote, "the danger from early frost diminishes." Certainly it wasn't just Canada that was behind the times. Others have written about the slow transition, the persistence of these ideas well into the 20th century. And in many respects, we can actually see that Canada is at the forefront of Victorian atmospheric science in the work that it has underway that are aiming to create a national climate index. In the mid-19th century, a network of observatories was established as part of Edward Sabine's project, encouraged by Alexander Humboldt, to marshal geomagnetic observations on a global scale. This was an imperial project put forth by the British Association for the Advancement of Science and accepted by the British government, which called for magnetic and meteorological observations at 4 observatories, which were in locations chosen based on knowledge of the Earth's magnetic field. So the locations were in Canada, Australia, the island of St. Helena, and the Cape of Good Hope. A permanent site was chosen for the Toronto Observatory, and regular observations began on January 1st, 1840, and there have been continuous observations from that site ever since. John Henry Lefroy took over as superintendent of the observatory in 1842 and promptly went on a northwest expedition in 1843-44. While wintering in Fort Chipewyan in Alberta, they took magnetic and temperature observations every hour from October 16th, 1843 to the 29th of February of 1844, and every 2 minutes for hours at a time during high magnetic disturbances. So, you know, it's winter, you're in Fort Chip, you've got time on your hands. But it speaks to this sort of obsession with data collecting that really is the history of meteorology in the late 19th century. On this particular trip, Lefroy traveled as far north as Fort Good Hope on the Mackenzie River and to establish the beginnings of a national network of Dominion meteorological posts and stations, essentially building on the existing network of missions and trade posts, which had served a long-standing role as meteorological outposts. So even though this knowledge wasn't, the record wasn't formalized up to that date, except insofar as, you know, the HBC or the Oblates were sort of systematizing their records. Now we have a new set of systematic records being collected across Canada. Some of the earliest observatories in Alberta were established in Medicine Hat and Edmonton in 1883. This is one government meteorologist in her Edmonton garden with her anemometer on the roof of her house, keeping her diligent record of weather. This is a somewhat less diligent record from Grand Prairie from 1913 to 1915. In the Met Office archives in the UK, there's many of the climatological returns from across Canada, from all these various meteorological outposts. This particular one's from St. John's College in Manitoba. It's for the month of November 1874. So these were the Royal Engineers climatological returns. And here's, I realized that none of you could actually read what was on that previous slide. Maybe you can read this one. So this is just examples of the information that they're collecting. So at 9 a.m. and at 9 p.m. every day, they're taking barometric temperature readings, wind, cloud, weather, and rain, as well as sort of extra observations and remarks. And they never doodled, which also surprised me. I would have thought that, like, you know, they have these ledgers, there's just sort of hundreds of them, and they're generally fairly legible, so, which is all quite good. More important to our purposes, if the drought or pluvial history of Canada, in fact, highlights the importance of regional climates, the meteorological work that's underway starts to assert a national climate. And in fact, we see sort of the synthetic charts that are being produced by the Meteorological Office, moving quickly from regional charts like this one, which is for Hudson Bay in eastern Canada in 1885, and it's just a weather map of isotherms, to a national weather map that's asserting a national climate for Canada by 1895. And this is the first of this series of weather maps, which, while excluding the north, in spite of the fact that there were meteorological outposts up there, is asserting sort of a national climate, at least for southern Canada. Some of this had, in fact, been previously done by Americans as sort of the northern extension of their meteorological record. The very top lines all lie within Canada there. So this work aimed to enable weather prediction via the relatively new science of meteorology. As historian Catherine Anderson has written, Victorians assumed that the problems of meteorology were ones of scale and complexity, challenging but given enough observation and coordination, ultimately tractable. They sought to elevate observation of the weather to a science, and in the process to distinguish it from unscientific or lay experiences of the weather, such as that which might be found in farmers' almanacs. The need to assert the methods and form of scientific meteorology, which we see in practice in Canada, also reveals the presence of its counterpart, lay understandings and experiences of weather and climate. And I'm just going to talk a bit about this briefly and then come back to it at the end of my talk as well. We also have to understand this in the context of the Prairie West, where, unlike Britain, long-established local knowledge is not, for the most part, from coming into direct conversation with the scientific efforts that are underway at least in the case of the Prairie West. There is, of course, Indigenous knowledge of weather and climate, and I hope to develop this more in the written portion of the paper. What I want to focus on today is actually the experience of settlers who, for the most part, were not influenced by this long-standing Indigenous knowledge of weather and climate. What we see in settler experiences is that before the 1920s and 1930s, much of the lay response to climate was framed around particular events, such as the 1912 tornado or the 1906-07 winter. In that particular instance, the winter of 1906-07, between November and May, high winds, record low temperatures, and unprecedented snowfall caused widespread discomfort, destruction, and numerous deaths from exposure or self-inflicted injuries throughout the region. There was fear of a fuel famine because of limited timber. Coal was available, but sometimes it lay at quite a distance. And there were numerous false accounts of people freezing to death. And one story that Joe Cherwinski recounted was of the Ratcliffe family, which apparently the father had gone out to fetch coal. On his way back, he died. The mother and the 3 children also died for freezing. And when the Northwest Mounted Police went to investigate this horrible tragedy, they found the Ratcliffe family healthy and hearty and hale and sitting in their house warming themselves by the fire. So these were false stories. What they did was they reflected the fears and met the climatic expectations of those who were hearing them and sharing them and passing them on. And really what they reinforced was this perception of a harsh subarctic Canadian climate in spite of McCune and Sifton's reconceptualization to the contrary. Expectations of harsh winters. Oh, sorry, there's yet another. If you're looking for postcards of the Prairie West, most of them seem to be urban street scenes in winter. So expectations of harsh winters were reflected in newspaper articles highlighting mild seasons. And presumably, if winters were in fact mild, nobody would have felt it was particularly newsworthy to write about it. But this one over here is the one that's cited as 1884, where they're talking about the charm of the climate in wintertime, that it's much nicer than Ontario. And the other one is talking about, you think this is the mild winter. When I was a young boy, when I was a wee lad, there was a mild winter. So we know, of course, that Calgary has mild winters.
Only for Chinook.
Well, that's true, yeah. So in a sense, really what they're doing is they're only determining what the climate of the western provinces were while they were engaged in settling it. In this instance, what we see is that they're actually building an understanding of weather observation as part of the state's role in the West. Part of this article makes reference to one winter there was a change of government in Ottawa and the weatherman was fired. Just to be contrary, he hid the weather records with the result that all points west of Winnipeg were forgotten. As a result, the prairies had no summer at all. So in a sense, what we see is that the state and the state's observations are in fact making the weather, according to this particular bit of humor work here. And I don't we have to recognize the role of the Meteorological Service as a long-standing agent of the state in a settler society with relatively few institutions. Meteorological observations predated the presence of the Northwest Mounted Police, for instance, and reinforced the perception of climate as an index or an average that could be discerned through observation, albeit both scientific and colloquial. As an index, inexperience combined with observation essentially normalized extremes, meaning that at least prior to the 1920s and 1930s, it's difficult to expect that settler society, at least, could have conceived of climate change in any kind of systematic fashion, notwithstanding, of course, the ways in which previous ideas about the malleability of climate itself and society to climate persisted. So in the last part, I want to talk about climate as an agent rather than just an index. It became clear in the 1920s and 1930s that assumptions and expectations about Western climate were a bit off. That the index had been built, whether from the meteorological station, and that the index that had been built, whether from the meteorological stations or in the memories of old-timers, would have to be revisited. From the perspective of settlers, there were bumper crops in the Alberta dry belt in 1915 and 1916, and settlement extended into the outlying dry belt as well. However, after those years, as that pluvial period ended, the desert reasserted itself, and in the worst hit subregions, there was not a crop of consequence until 1927. There are accounts that many of you might be familiar with of families, for instance, who in 1922 had gone 6 years in a row without a crop and had only had 2 crops since they'd initially settled in 1909. That said, expectations and assumptions about local climate were still in flux. The commission appointed to inquire into, report on, and make recommendations in regard to matters affecting the welfare of that part of the province of Alberta, generally known as the Tilley East area, was one of 5 commissions of inquiry examining the crisis centered on southern Alberta and namely on a community called Alderson. The commission remarked upon, quote, the extent of the depopulation and the rapidity with which the present private owners are allowing their interests to lapse, and they emphasized the role of crop failure. That said, at the time, we also see in this commission that, quote, at the time the meetings were held, most of the settlers were fairly optimistic as to the prospects for 1926, as they claimed that they had never gone into the spring's work in any year since the area was settled, when there was so much moisture in the ground. But their expectations were not realized, and the fall saw another disastrous crop year. Here we see the commission report highlighting the low average rainfall, citing the 40-plus years of records from Medicine Hat, which demonstrated that the land was unsuitable for cultivation. And so we see a turn to the meteorological record. The commissioners asserting that the accumulated knowledge of the climate, the index, so to speak, demonstrated the unsuitability of the region for farming. Even at, of course, the same time that the optimism of settlers that very year that a crop would be possible. Settlers also emphasized the variability within the region, that some of the lands and microclimates were better than others, and expressed the desire to return those that couldn't be farmed to ranching, except, of course, that lands which had been under cultivation for a number of years were essentially valueless for grazing purposes, and it would take many years to bring them back. So even as causes and responses were under debate, the consequences were readily apparent. Farm abandonment in Alberta was greatest in 1926. 4 times the number of farms were abandoned in the 20s as opposed to the 30s. And it was only in the northernmost part of the Alberta dry belt that abandonments increased in the 1930s. Sorry, I'm just going to pass over that one. When rains returned after 1926, some of the settlers did too, but then the experience of the 30s forced them out again. And there were, of course, the dust storms. It wasn't just drought, however, and dust storms. There was also hail, which destroyed this particular crop. And after 1933, grasshoppers, which were of sufficient historical importance to be captured in a photograph for the Glenbow Archives, and a blizzard in the 1935-36 winter. The 1937 was the worst year in which the desert spread extensively. One understanding of climate as an agent in this instance appears in a poem written by Lois Valley and cited by David C. Jones in his work, Empire of Dust, in which she describes, she characterizes the snow and the climate in general, the savage wind, as a force in opposition to her experience in the plains. And this is, she's writing, she lived just south of Alderson, and she's writing this between 1934 and 1938. So much recent research into paleoclimate in the plains has demonstrated simply that the knowledge of past climate available to settlers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was insufficient, and that what happened in the 1930s was that the normal climate of the plains returned and reasserted itself. Moreover, this same research has emphasized that the droughts of the 1920s and 1930s were relatively modest in the longer history of the region. The same research that is explaining the causal connections for droughts has also demonstrated the existence of so-called megadroughts in the North American West since 800 AD. In particular, there were 3 megadrought epochs centered on about 1034, 1150, and 1253. And a megadrought is essentially, in distinction to a recent drought, which might last at most a decade, these medieval megadroughts lasted for decades at a time and came in quick succession. So there again we see the question arising of what what is the normal for this particular region. And here is just some of the extent of some of these droughts. Again, from the perspective of Americans interested in the past. But even in the most recent past, since the 18th century, the aridity of the region is clear. So you have extensive drought periods here, and really nothing comparable in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The 20th century lacked these prolonged droughts, even if 1937 was a peak year in terms of dryness. This is, in the end, a clear example of climate interacting with farming practices and settlement desires in a process of adaptation. Farm abandonment and the emphasis that land was unsuitable for farming and only suitable for grazing in the 1920s represented climate's active role in shaping the opportunities for human society and economy. David Jones quoted William G. Wenburn of Tabor, who described himself in the 1920s as, quote, a man that came, saw, and has not conquered. The far more dramatic experience of the 1930s showed climate continuing to act in an important way. Although the drama, the dust storms, in fact reflected not climate but agricultural practice, as they were a product of climate conditions acting upon an environment where the prevailing farming methods had disrupted the topsoil. Here we see not only the importance of climate as an agent in history and not simply an index of history, but also the significance of climatic change even when it is within quote-unquote natural bounds and not anthropogenic. Without going whole hog over to determinism, what I'm asserting here isn't deterministic, because I don't wish to present this as a struggle that was an inevitable encounter between people, an intractable land, and a harsh climate, but rather because it arose from the expectations of normalcy created by a different climate that coincided with Dominion government policy promoting a particular kind of agricultural settlement. So, just to conclude, the prominent eco-critic Lawrence Buell wrote in 2005 that, quote, issues of vision, value, culture, and imagination are keys to today's environmental crisis, at least as fundamental as scientific research, technological know-how, and legislative regulation. I would add to his definition the history of knowledge-making and scientific practice as vehicles for or expressions of value, vision, culture, and imagination of people in the past, and as explored in my talk today. Such an exploration enables us to go beyond viewing climate change as an expression of postmodern anxieties about nature, which is one of the ways in which it's currently being talked about. Jerome Namias in 1989, he's a meteorologist, described how, quote, the greenhouse effect is now firmly part of our collective angst, along with nuclear winter, asteroid collisions, and other widely bruited global nightmares. What instead it helps us to do is to see how we have made and how we are making climate into a transformative agent in our own history. Climate, in many respects, remains the other, particularly in environmental histories. We often see people turning to, if they're looking for a non-anthropogenic influence on environment in the past, climate is the other factor. You see this in the overkill hypotheses from the Pleistocene extinctions. Was it human hunting or was it climate? You see it in fires. Was it lightning strikes, aka climate, or was it anthropogenic? So in many respects, we're really driving home this idea of climate as this other. And I was recently reading an issue of Pages newsletter, and Pages is sort of the past global, it's a newsletter that reports on paleoclimate research done by the scientific community. So it's stuff that is of interest to me, but that my work most certainly does not contribute to, because they're interested in the thousands and millions of years, not the hundreds or 50. Anyhow, they were having a series of debates in this newsletter, and Tim Lenton wrote with regards to Earth system models that, quote, Earth system models are still at the heart climate models with bits added on. So in a sense, what he was saying is that nature on a global scale is essentially being modeled as climate with bits added on. He continued, this is of course sensible if, as many of us believe, climate change is the most dangerous global change that we as a species are driving. So he acknowledges the artifice of the model as being predicated in part on our predictive belief that climate is, quote, the most dangerous global change. And he concludes, but it is worth considering that another global change might turn out to be more important. And this is, of course, when we start getting scared. If, for example, our rampant mining of phosphates and fixing of nitrogen could ultimately trigger a global oceanic anoxic event, do we have a well-posed tool to assess this? Century-scale climate models are clearly inappropriate. So, all that to say that, in a sense, climate is obviously not the only dangerous global change, and we're all familiar with this from other studies of environmental history. But what we have to ask, what Lenton isn't asking there, but what his comments push us to ask, is where did this belief come from, that climate was the most dangerous global change that we are driving? And does this rationale still hold? And likewise, how have these kinds of ideas about climate shaped our past? What kinds of consequences can such thinking have? The answers to these questions in the context of Canada, I hope I have in some small part provided today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that engaging tour de force through scientific and historical literatures. The floor is open for questions. Julie.
Lisa, I'm wondering whether in the very early models, like say turn of the century, was Little Ice Age ever invoked in Canada for, in some way? I'm thinking that in Europe we get lots of references to Little Ice Age and the effect it had. You didn't mention.
Yes, the Little Ice Age is invoked. And what you see is sort of an interest in particular in glaciation in Alberta, but less so in the Little Ice Age, because the most dramatic evidence on the land is from the earlier periods of glaciation, whereas I think that while there is sort of an interest in finding the Little Ice Age, that isn't what most people turn to for sort of to drive research and whatnot. So.
Matthew.
Thanks. It's a very interesting talk. Just give me a comment as much as a question. A plug for irrigation as a dimension of this. It occurred to me that despite all the optimistic descriptions of the Canadian West for settlement, there were practically some cautious approaches to homesteading in certain sections of Southern Alberta, such as Saskatchewan, I'm sure aware, and restrictions on homesteading, partly driven by perception of climate and the inability for farming in the area, which then pressed irrigation policy in the late 19th century as a way to respond to climate. But what I found interesting in looking at irrigation in this context was that there was some discussion about irrigation as potentially a climate-changing sort of practice, which would have some impact on not only climate, but the shape of settlements and the morality of settlements too. So just another thread to add to the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I turned, I went to the sort of clear, obvious, cases of ignorance as opposed to the efforts at mitigation, but that I wasn't aware of them talking about it as something that would change climate. But that's the thing, that there's actually, once you start looking for this language of the ability to actually affect climate change, you start finding it in a lot more places than you'd think. And I was really struck by this because I think that climate has long figured in the late 20th century and early 21st century as sort of the thing that until the whole issue of anthropogenic climate change, we couldn't affect. That is the narrative that prevails in our present. And when you look at it, actually, that's sort of a myth that we've created mostly in the mid to late 20th century. I think that those who are saying that it's changing in the 19th century are a bit hasty in saying that it's changing as early as that, because at least in Canada, the way in which these other ideas about climate change, the other thing, that you have to, that comes into play in the 20th century as well is, of course, the fact that there's also, considerable new research into, beginning in the 40s and 50s, I believe, into, of course, controlling climate, whether by salting clouds, in conjunction with hurricane sort of monitoring efforts in the United States, and sort of new uses for airplanes. So there's this, there's also that part of what's going on as well. So how we actually ended up at the point where we didn't see humans as being able to influence climate, when clearly that's been sort of part and parcel of what we've been doing all along, is something that I think is interesting, to say the least. Sorry.
Tina.
I just want to pick up on that. I'm wondering about your periodization. So why do you, and mostly why you end in 1940, because it seems, what is it that changes then? And you started to gesture towards that, because when we think about climate science, we really do think about a science that took on new meaning, new sources of funding in the Cold War, right? And when you get Roger Revelle and all that stuff that's going on at Scripps, and the U.S. Navy being involved. So I'm just wanting to hear why you've chosen that endpoint, but the periodization anyway.
So I chose that endpoint because I was getting in danger of turning this into an entirely new book project, which I didn't agree I'd signed on to when I said I'd write a chapter that's only 6,000 words, notwithstanding. So, because, that was actually one of the things that I started, a route I started to travel down and then stopped, because basically it was all new research, which is the history of earth sciences in the late 20th century, and why it is that that in effect they take control of discussions about climate, which is something that the article by Loche and Fressoz sort of allude to, which is that you have that their timing, their periodicity of the late 19th or the mid 19th century transition lies with the fact that it's in 1885 that they set the Holocene, they set the name of the Holocene for our most recent sort of geological era, and that by, in a sense, defining by sort of hiving off the Holocene in that fashion, they make the only climate change that matters glacial, and thus firmly wrest sort of climate dynamics from other groups, meteorological scientists being one, and sort of put it in the hands of earth scientists. And in the hands of earth scientists, really interesting things happen in the Cold War and afterwards, in part because at least by the 60s and 70s, there's also knowledge of greenhouse gases and how they function. Sorry, I was up at 5 o'clock this morning with my son, so my brain is getting a bit skittish. But by the 1960s, you have, for instance, the evidence from Hawaii of accumulated greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, or accumulated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the greenhouse role that it might be playing. And then, subsequent to that, you also then have the question of why is it that earth scientists are among the most prominent skeptics and deniers. And this is where I sort of alluded in the first part of my talk that there's actually a whole sort of flip history about how Western Canada is transforming climate. That's part of where that can go. That is more than 6,000 words will permit me to engage with. So what I decided to do, given that the topic at hand was the transformation of Canada, and the history of Canada. That's why I chose to take what is sort of this central story in Canadian history. It's sort of like a kind of, especially in Western Canada, it's kind of it's one of these stories that gets revisited and revisited. And to ask, okay, well, what does this, very well-known story tell us, and the way in which it is always seen to have changed Canada, tell us about this larger set of relationships between people and the climate, and their understanding of what this thing, the climate, is, and whether it is just, an average set of conditions, or whether it is actually a force and a presence in their lives. And for that story, you can stop in 1940, I think. That I don't think that getting into that other really interesting story is its own kettle of fish. So.
You know,
As far as the latter half of the Western Canadian history that you're talking about, perhaps depending on who wins the provincial election, maybe a new chapter may be about to begin in that saga. My question is it's a bit expansive, so answer it as you see fit. But I think it's interesting that you're coming from the north in a way, because your original work on this pertains to northern Canada, and then, as you mentioned, also a bit of Atlantic Canada as well. So how has starting with those regions shaped the way that you're asking questions and perhaps interpreting data about Western Canada, which is perhaps a much better known regional story insofar as climate and history are concerned? So how is starting with those other, perhaps less known about or less thought of regions shape the way you come to this regional history?
So one of the ways is that I get very interested when they talk about the subarctic climate in the West, and just where those lines are drawn. But actually, I think perhaps the most important question, and this is again one that isn't readily apparent in the historical literature or in the source material, is this question of the interrelationships between settlers, scientists, Indigenous people, and knowledge of climate and weather. When looking at the North, one of the things is there are a lot of really sort of compelling examples that I can think of clear sort of different understandings of how nature works with regards to climate, and conversations being had between Indigenous people in particular and scientific, people interested in science. And Julie Cruikshank, of course, has written about many of these. There's countless other, there's not countless other examples, but there are other really important examples from across the Arctic and subarctic. David Hambury comes to mind as well, and he's really interested in what Inuit guides are telling him about climate and that relationship is really key to the knowledge that's created in the North. In the West, you do have something similar at play with the expeditions that go west. Hind had guides, Palliser had guides, from whom that same kind of transfer of knowledge or co-construction of knowledge is taking place. But in a sense, my periodization comes after them. I'm actually, I'm, which, because, and has, instead focused on this sort of experience of people coming in and settling in a region where, in a sense, they're making their own knowledge as they go along. And that too links to the work that I've done on Atlantic Canada, where you did also have sort of longer term in place knowledge about climate and weather. And that too sort of shapes sort of larger processes, social and economic processes that are at work. So what I find compelling in a way, and I don't know if I should be embarrassed to say this, is this kind of settler history. Like, I've never been interested in pioneer settler history in the West until I started looking at this, because to me it is, what is really interesting is, how is it when you move into a new place that you start to normalize what you see around you? And likewise, the role of the state in pushing what the normals are. Because in a lot of other, when people settle in New Brunswick, when loyalists come up to New Brunswick in the early 19th century, the state isn't doing much to help them figure out climate. So to me, I think that outside of sort of rethinking some sort of well-known stories in Western history from a perspective that enables us to ask questions about climate, the thing that is interesting because of what I've seen in these other regions is that particular dynamic. I also just, it's also, I think the other thing that sort of comes up with the Prairie West is, of course, that this is now where I'm living. And so I'm very interested to know about these mega droughts and how long they're going to stick around and how much I'm going to have to deal with. So.
I've been reading the information coming from the University of Regina about the mega droughts.
I'm familiar with some of it. Dick Sawson is one of the
information coming on mega droughts from the University of Regina.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very interesting study, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a good historical story. The history of Canada almost changed because a young guy named John Diefenbaker got lost in a snowstorm, and an uncle rescued him.
Oh, okay. No John Deep, no Bill of Rights.
Dave.
I was interested in the idea of climate as agent, and wanted to sort of put that beside your invocation of Sifton. And I wouldn't say that the climate, as agent is like deputy minister or anything, but every time I think of Sifton, I think of the advertising for immigrants in Eastern and Northern Europe, because we have sort of hardy souls who are going to be able to deal with the climate and have sort of a comparative experience on rural landscapes from home into the new country. Any thing there that you're playing with, this sort of call for particular immigrant populations that will align with climate type and sort of be successful in thinking of Sifton and these officials?
I think that, that obviously sort of speaks to this notion of sort of the mutual changeability of climate and people, that races are formed in particular climates. Even though perhaps at the higher levels of learned discourse they dispensed with this notion, Sifton is, of course, the perfect example of how, when it came to the practical application of immigration policy, those kinds of ideas are still very much at work. But, in a sense, I'm more interested, I think that in a sense, I don't get the sense that Sifton, and I should be cautious here, just because what I'm more interested are what the people on the ground, and so the commissioner is conducting commissions of inquiry rather than Sifton. How they're not like that's advertising in just the same way that advertising performs a certain function and plays on stereotypes and simplifications in the later part of the 20th century. It does at the turn of the century too, and so I think that we can only look so far to those representations to understand what it was that people did in fact think about. And it's hard to sort of, and this is a question that's I've been preoccupied in different ways for a long time, like what people think about the climate and the weather, because a lot of the time they don't really think, they don't articulate their thoughts, or they don't really think, isn't it sort of the classic example that British people talk about the weather so that they can avoid having to talk about anything else of substance? So, they're actively, like, no offense to any British people in the room, but, that this idea that you're sort of, that you're using it as sort of a mask, it's a neutral, it's something that you don't think about, it's something that's there. And the more research that I've done into climate and people's thoughts about it, of course, if you're looking there, you're going to find it that people actually do have systematic and interesting ideas about how climate influences their lives and how they might influence climate. So I think that though getting at that where possible, and so what you kind of need are episodes of dramatic climatic change to ask those kinds of questions, or sort of scientific research into the norms, and those are the two places where you end up finding what people think.
Do you have those sorts of sources available?
Where people talk about what they think about climate. Well, I think like a lot of the, it is sort of, it comes out in a lot of the discussions around what happens in southern Alberta in the 20s and 30s. Less so than you might want it to come out, because of course, even though climate is seen as a factor, the driving issues are economic and are focused on land use and land abandonment and crops and fertility and all that kind of stuff. So when they actually turn to say something about climate, it's usually sort of buried in the midst of all of that. But they do talk about it. The other, and this is sort of comes back to what exactly is climate change, and what is climate, and where is it getting constructed and how is it getting constructed, and knowing that if you go into the historical record looking for people using the word climate, you're not necessarily going to find anything of any use. But if you go into the historical record looking for what people thought about the rains or something, that will give you a better indication, or deforestation or desertification, that climate is sort of a thing that only emerges in certain places. We talk about it a lot right now, but we haven't necessarily talked about it as much in the past. So.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, there's, climate change is such a contemporary buzz, and I was just wondering how you see your historical work fitting into contemporary debates about climate change, just in comparison to, say, Al Gore's message in his movie or something, or if that's even something that's crossed your mind, or if you think it influenced your research question in the first place, just the contemporary buzz. I'm not sort of asking you to talk about the oil sands or anything like that. I'm thinking about if you care about that contribution. Not that I think it would be a bad thing if you didn't, but
I think in a sense, I do care about climate change. I think but I haven't, my way of thinking about it hasn't come so much from Al Gore necessarily, as it has come from when I was a teenager. My father, who's a earth scientist, told me that in my lifetime it was likely that sea level would rise due to global warming, and I was like, oh, and it really terrified me because that's a scary thing to hear when you're a teenager. And so one of the things that I find, and here I'm just being totally frank, one of the things I find useful about studying these kinds of questions in the past is that they make climate change a bit less scary because they put it in terms that I am schooled in dealing with, which is sort of historical research. And so it enables me to sort of but deal with the fact that I, for instance, live in a province that if the election turns out the way everybody's saying it's going to turn out, is going to just continue to accelerate its contribution to greenhouse gases and environmental destruction. So, so in that sense, I think that talking through these things and researching them provides sort of some kind of way of dealing with, serious environmental issues. In terms of the practical contribution that historical research can make to questions of climate change in our present day context, that's harder because a lot of the first project that I did on historical climate was essentially historical climatology, taking a farmer's diary and trying to figure out if I could see the Tambora weather event in New Brunswick, and I could. And historical climatology has long been a very sort of important avenue in which historians can contribute to our understanding of climate change. So historical climatology, when I use that term, I just mean, taking historical documents and turning them into data about past environments. Just as these scientists said, okay, we'll use this poor instrumental record that goes back to 1856 because we've got nothing better. Well, historians have considerably, and we know the work of Christian Pfister and Rudolf Bratzel in Europe, have considerably deepened our understanding of historical climate change through their work with documents or with visible changes on the landscape. One of the things that I think has happened with historical climate change, however, in recent years, is that it has gone from being kind of the work of historians to actually being done more by scientists. So there was just recently an article about some biologists who'd worked with Thoreau's journals and, you know, looking at how flowering plants were indicative of climate change in that particular region. And I think that's actually a really promising development because it shows that the sort of the methodologies of historical climatology are interdisciplinary in character and of sufficient importance to people outside of just history that others have taken up and run with it. And that you don't necessarily need historians to do that work. If you're simply interested in sort of historical climate modeling or historical climate reconstructions, what historians can do are to pose these very critical questions about why is it that we're organizing this information and building these models in the first place. And I do think that there's a really, and that's why I closed with that sort of comment that I found about Earth systems models being essentially climate models with bits added on. Climate has really become an organizing principle for a whole series of understandings that we have about the natural world. And I think as historians, we are very well equipped to ask questions about why that is the case and what implications does that have for the kinds of research that gets done, the kinds of politics that ensue, and so forth. So, you know, I think that's, and, you know, and in a sense, I'm kind of glad to move from the historical climatology into the investigations of the constructions of knowledge, because as with historical climatology, we were always in danger of just being data miners, and I was in danger of spending 30 years transcribing diaries to find out that it rained in, you know, somewhere, sometime in the 1930s or something like that. And, you know, that's not, I think that while that work is important, you know, there's a lot of current examples of, there's this great website called oldweather.org where they're basically crowdsourcing. So they've posted all these ship's logs and they're getting people to go online and transcribe the ship's logs for them. So, and that's, you know, that's exactly how it should be done. It shouldn't be done by well-paid people sitting in offices in transcribing all of this stuff, because if what you're trying to do is just get at the models and perfect the models, there's much more efficient ways of getting at that information. So, sorry, Tina.
I think I'm going to push on this question because I was struck by how you ended the talk about it. And I'm going to pose this provocatively. If one of the things historians can contribute is to deconstruct our current concern with climate, is there not, if you think that climate change is a pressing environmental, social, and political problem, is there not a danger of playing into the politics of denial? Saying, oh, this is just something that's been invented and it's got all this funding, and in fact there's other global events like the guy in Pages said that we're not paying attention to because we've become captured by climate change. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of a variation of the critique that was made of William Cronin's deconstruction of wilderness, right? That if we say wilderness is a human construct, we've then taken away the moral high ground on which many environmentalists depend to make their cases for preservation and conservation. So, are you not doing the same?
Yes, there certainly is that danger, and it's just the same danger as you see within, I think, you know, within the where you know, that danger isn't very real. That climate is just a construct. Climate change, yeah, is, you know. Also, I guess one of the things I'm thinking of is that it's not the first time that historical research would have been used to promote the skeptic's position, because, you know, all that historical climatology work, Timothy Ball, who was one of the, you know, better historical climatologists coming out of the 70s and 80s, is also a very prominent skeptic, and, you know, sort of talks up the fact, oh, you know, climate change, it's happened before, it'll happen again. And this is precisely why the earth science community has been so intractable, you know, in a sense intractable about the whole issue of climate change, because they do look at climate change on the scale of Earth's history, and you know, you hear these sort of, or they engage in these sort of dispassionate debates about, you know, methane sort of ejections into the atmosphere at the that cause sort of very rapid warming. I can't remember the Permian Eocene boundary or something. Anyways, I'm showing the limits of of this stuff. But so yes, I think that talking, that it can be picked up and used by skeptics for those purposes. I think if it's, I guess my only answer is that that's not a reason not to do it.
Oh, and I'm not suggesting it is, but I just want to hear
It's not a reason not to do it, and I think if done well and done with the knowledge that they're going to do that precisely in mind, that it can continue to serve an important purpose, and that's actually why I think that that the whole that the issue about how Western Canada is transforming climate is in fact the other part that needs to be kind of joined to the climate change is being constructed, but yeah, there's some, and there are very active, that there's very explicit political interests, just like we see explicit political interests, in terms of Sifton and others engaged in constructing a climate as normal and as amenable to settlement, that showing that these positions are all vulnerable to, political interpretation, other kinds of aspirations, particularly economic ones, I think can only serve to illuminate some of the difficulties that we're dealing with right now. And if ultimately the desire is to have some kind of, to make some kind of, however minor, sort of interjection or is interjection a word? Intervention, thank you. Then, that's a way that it can be done. So,
I think that's a very good point at which to end the discussion and to thank Lisa.